Hello and welcome to ARIRANG News. I'm Lee Ji-yoon in Seoul. Let's get a check on today's headlines. President Park Geun-hye nominates a ruling party lawmaker as our new prime minister. She's also reshuffling some key government posts. Korea's economy grows at its slowest pace in more than 2 years in the fourth quarter of last year due to a drop in exports and the slowing Chinese economy. The European Central Bank announces a massive stimulus package, pumping some $1.25 trillion into the eurozone's sagging economy. With our approval rating sitting an all-time low after a document leak scandal from our office and the government's revised tax policy, President Park Geun-hye announced a nominee for new prime minister earlier today. She also reorganized the presidential office. Our Choi Yoo-sun has more.
President Park has nominated the ruling party's floor leader Lee Ji-yoon as her new prime minister. Lee, a three-term lawmaker, is thought to have gotten the president's nod for how he negotiated thorny issues with the opposition as floor leader in the past year.
The nominee fully understands President Park's policy direction and has closely cooperated with the opposition to restore parliamentary proceedings. He's the right person to carry through the economic innovation plan, public sector reforms, and communicating with and working for the public.
Friday's nomination was widely expected after the president retained Prime Minister Chung Hong-won last year, despite his resignation to take responsibility for the government's botched handling of the Seoul ferry disaster. While Lee needs to get parliamentary approval to take office, there's been no announcement yet on the nominee for the vacant seat of Oceans Minister. In a likely response to her approval ratings plunging to 30% following allegations of her aides abusing power and disorder within her office, President Park reduced authority of some of her longtime aides. But her chief of staff, the one many watchers had speculated will be dismissed, is going to stay put for now. Instead, the president has named a new senior policy coordination secretary, Hyun Jung-taek, to better coordinate her policies inside the presidential office. President Park also announced a new lineup of 4 special advisors whose main task will be to actively communicate the president's policies with parliament. Meanwhile, President Park's civil affairs secretary was promoted to senior secretary after his former boss Kim Young-han resigned, having refused to appear at a parliamentary hearing for a recent document leak scandal. Choi Yoo-sun, ARIRANG News.
And a new prime minister nominee, Lee Ji-yoon, promised to speed up the country's economic recovery and reforms if he's confirmed as prime minister. Speaking to reporters right after the presidential office announced his nomination, the three-term lawmaker said improving the economy and the livelihoods of the people are on top of his agenda. As for the growing rift between opposing parties, Lee said it's important that rival political camps communicate with one another. When asked about what kind of prime minister he plans to be, he said he'd be a straight talker.
I believe a good prime minister should not hesitate to be honest and forthright with the president. I will try to be a prime minister that speaks his mind, even if what I say is critical of the president.
The main opposition New Politics Alliance for Democracy welcomed the nomination, although it said it won't go easy on Lee at his confirmation hearing. The party's deputy floor leader, An Kyu-baek, said he seems willing to actively communicate with and respect the opposition camp. Patience is the key when it comes to dealing with North Korea. That's what President Park Geun-hye believes in, as she said, South Korea is in no hurry and will continue to wait for North Korea to come back to dialogue. In a video message to hundreds of global CEOs at Korea Night on the sidelines of this year's World Economic Forum in Davos, President Park said Seoul will step up cooperation with Pyongyang and also increase private sector exchanges. As for unification of the two Koreas, the president said a unified Korea will not only help Korea to gain a new growth engine, it will be also a new driving force for the global economy. The U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee is trying to impose tougher sanctions on North Korea. Committee Chairman Ed Royce said Thursday that the committee will introduce its legislation on the sanctions to deprive the Kim Jong-un regime of hard currency. The decision follows a recent hack attack on Sony, which the FBI has concluded that North Korea was behind the attack. Royce introduced a similar bill last year, which passed the House but failed to pass the Senate. The committee also seeks to expand sanctions on Iran to pressure the country to stop developing nuclear weapons. Hot on the heels of the surprising news that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is considering visiting Moscow in the spring for a special anniversary celebration, it seems the two countries may be pushing for tighter economic cooperation. Our Connie Kim reports.
North Korea and Russia may be further boosting their economic ties. The South Korean daily Chosunilbo reported Friday that Pyongyang and Moscow are pushing to launch a $30 billion project. Under the plan, Russia would rebuild North Korea's aging power grid and transmit electricity to the north. In exchange, North Korea would give Russia metals such as gold and copper. Experts say the new deal would be a win for both countries. About 60 to 70% of North Korea's electricity is reportedly leaking from its power transmission facilities. And analysts say Russia will benefit by making use of natural resources that are under export sanctions by the European Union over the Ukraine crisis. Last year, the two countries agreed on a $25 billion project to repair the North's railways. North Korea and Russia's move toward greater economic cooperation comes amid signs of improving diplomatic ties between the two countries. On Wednesday, the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un gave a positive signal to Russian President Vladimir Putin's invitation to an anniversary event in Moscow in May. If Kim accepts, it'll be the first time a North Korean leader has not chosen China as his first overseas destination since the Korean War. Insiders say, however, it'll take time for Pyongyang and Moscow to expand their bilateral ties. Economically, the trade volume between North Korea and China was 65 times larger than trade between Pyongyang and Moscow in 2013. Connie Kim, ARIRANG News.
The Korean economy grew at its slowest pace in more than 2 years in the fourth quarter of last year, setting off alarm bells among economic policymakers here in Korea who have been pouring all their efforts into trying to boost growth. Our Hwang Jae has the details.
There are signs that Korea might be falling into a low-growth trap, with the Bank of Korea saying the economy grew 0.4% in the fourth quarter from a quarter earlier. That marks the slowest pace of growth since the July to September period of 2012 and 5 straight quarters of growth below 1%. The central bank attributes the slowdown to a drop in exports hit by the slowing Chinese economy, which makes up 26% of all of Korea's exports.
Due to sluggish exports, output in the manufacturing sector also contracted for 2 straight quarters in the October to December period last year. This is what we'll keep an eye on.
With the country's traditional growth engine exports looking like they're losing momentum, there's no good news on the domestic front either. Private spending grew a mere 0.5% in the fourth quarter, slowing from the 1% growth posted in the previous quarter. For all of 2014, domestic consumption grew 1.7%, the slowest pace since 2009 when Korea was hit by the global financial crisis. Still, the central bank says the Korean economy is on a recovery track, pointing to some exceptional factors like a fall in government spending that dragged down construction investments by more than 9% in the fourth quarter from the previous one. But experts express concerns that the slowing growth could turn into a long-term trend stemming from structural problems like the snowballing household debt. Asia's fourth-largest economy grew 3.3% in 2014 from a year earlier, an uptick from the 3% growth posted in 2013, but far below the 4% growth the central bank forecast a year ago. Hwang Jae, ARIRANG News.
Meanwhile, the European Central Bank has announced the details of its massive stimulus package in a desperate attempt to stop the flagging eurozone shuddering to a halt. The central bank says it's going to inject roughly $1.25 trillion into financial markets. Our Shin Se-min has more.
The European Central Bank says it's going to buy an unprecedented amount of bonds, pumping money into the stagnant eurozone economy. The central bank said Thursday that its purchases of government and private sector bonds worth 60 billion euros, or roughly $68 billion will begin in March and continue through at least September of next year, or even longer. The total will reach some $1.3 trillion, much more than the $568 billion initially expected. Speaking in Frankfurt on Thursday, ECB President Mario Draghi said the central bank would also keep eurozone interest rates at 0.05%. The decision comes as the eurozone is showing signs of growing into a deflationary spiral. It's hoped the massive stimulus will improve the bloc's sluggish exports and channel more investments into stocks. Not everyone is happy about the decision. German Chancellor Angela Merkel, for instance, wants countries like Greece and Italy to tighten their belts and stick to their original economic reforms.
Two things are part of this: a willingness to show solidarity, which we will continue to show, coupled with a willingness to take responsibility, which I am sure will continue to be shown by Greece.
The ECB money will also include some existing programs. Greece will be included under a bailout program, but with some additional criteria, as such countries have worse economic conditions. The announcement stunned traders, with most markets across Europe posting gains. Stocks on Wall Street also reacted positively. On the currency markets, the euro slumped to an 11-year low of $1.13 against the greenback. Shin Se-min, ARIRANG News.
The European Central Bank stimulus program is expected to have a positive effect on the Korean economy. A senior official at Korea's finance ministry says the move will help Europe recover from its prolonged economic slump. The official added the massive injection of more euros into the market will depreciate the currency, which will benefit Korean companies with manufacturing plants in Europe. Finance Minister Park Geun-hye also said that bond buying programs will help boost growth in Europe, which will help the overall global economy. Saudi Arabia's King Abdullah, who had been ill from pneumonia and a lung infection, passed away at 1 a.m. on Friday. Saudi state TV said he would be succeeded by his half-brother, 79-year-old Prince Salman, who had already begun to take on some of the king's responsibilities. King Abdullah was known as a leader who tried to modernize his very conservative society by providing more opportunities for the kingdom's women and its growing youth population. His passing comes at a challenging time for Saudi Arabia, the biggest oil producer in the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Oil prices jumped after the announcement. Futures advanced by 3% in New York and 2.6% in London. To the chaos in Yemen, a major U.S. ally in the Middle East is without a government or leader today. Its president, along with the prime minister and cabinet, resigned on Thursday, leaving the government's opponents to take the reins. Connie Lee has more.
After days of turmoil, Yemen is in even deeper chaos today. Its president stepped down on Thursday night, shortly after the prime minister and cabinet also called it quits. The resignations come a day after President Abed Mansur Rabu Hadi and the Shiite rebels known as Houthis signed a tentative peace deal. Under the deal, the Houthis, a minority group which has felt marginalized in the primarily Sunni country, agreed to pull their fighters out from government institutions in exchange for greater political power. However, even after the deal, the Houthis continued to occupy key parts of Yemen, including the president's residence, which was seized on Tuesday. The country, now without a leader, is of great concern to the United States and its allies. Yemen has been a key ally in the fight against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is, according to Western intelligence, the most dangerous branch of al-Qaeda. The group recently made headlines after claiming responsibility for the killings in Paris at the offices of French magazine Charlie Hebdo. On Thursday, the UN envoy to Yemen has called on the rival groups in Yemen to uphold the earlier agreement to share power and to avoid the violence.
I call you all to have wisdom and national spirit, give priority to the national interests of Yemen, and use dialogue and political action to resolve any of political disagreement away from violence, extortion, and procrastination.
The U.S. has also responded by reducing its embassy staff there due to safety concerns and said it's still assessing what a leaderless Yemen means for the West. However, the State Department added that its top priority in Yemen remains as the effort to fight terrorism. Connie Lee, ARIRANG News.
After 5 weeks on the top of the charts, it looks like Ode to My Father will finally make way for a new film this weekend. Following a long line of Korean gangster films, Gangnam Blues, starring Lee Min-ho, opened this week in theaters. Our film critic Piers Conran is here to tell us about the film and to fill us in on the history of the gangster genre in Korea. Welcome, Piers. So what can you tell us about this entry into this Korean gangster genre of the films?
Well, Gangnam Blues, which is simply called Gangnam 1970 in Korean, it's the new film by director Yoo-ha. He's a well-known genre filmmaker who, of course, conquered the gangster genre in the past with 2006's A Dirty Carnival, which is well known as one of the best Korean gangster films out there. This new film, it's actually set in 1970, and it deals with two orphans who become best friends, and they're trying to kind of scrape a living in kind of a shanty towns south of the Han River, and then they become involved in these kind of gangster skirmishes, and they get separated. And 3 years later, they're both in different gangs. And this is at the period in the 1970s when gangs were kind of in collusion with the government. They were trying to buy up all this farmland in the area that is now known as Gangnam. And so there's a lot of kind of interesting political context, and of course, it's a gangster film as well. And starring in the lead role is Lee Min-ho, who's an incredibly popular Korean drama star. He was the star of The Heirs and City Hunter, and this is his first lead role in a film, though he used to be star in films much before he was famous. And alongside him is Kim Rae-won of Sunflower.
Okay, well, quite an interesting premise. Well, do you think it'll do well in Korea, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's off to a good start. It opened on Wednesday, and so far it's attracted about 300,000 viewers, which is certainly promising.
Wow.
Beyond that, I think the presence of Lee Min-ho alone is enough to make sure that people will certainly be coming out in the first week or so. And looking at gangster films, they've been quite successful over the years in Korea. The last few years in particular, there have been some very popular ones. And I think if we throw in a gangster film is mostly aimed for people in their 20s, often men in their 20s, but with the kind of the 70s context here, and the whole soundtrack is 70s Korean music, which is really wonderful. And I think this kind of could appeal to a broader demographic. So we'll see how it does. The film is quite dark, and I'm not completely sure how people will take to it. It's very ambitious, but I think it'll certainly make its money back. And with a little luck, word of mouth could turn it into a hit.
Okay, well, have you seen the film? How do you feel about it?
I have, and I must say that I had very high expectations because Dirty Carnival is actually one of my favorite Korean films, and I do love Korean gangster films, and I'm just very, very pleased to say that the film did not disappoint at all. It has this really ambitious backdrop and a really interesting kind of political backdrop, and I think that kind of really adds weight to a fairly familiar tale of brotherhood in a gangster setting. Beyond that, it has this incredible period detail and really extraordinary photography. I think it's one of the most well-made Korean films, and that's really saying something because, as we all know, Korean cinema is just really at the top of its game, the technical department these days. And if you add in this kind of really evocative 70s feel and the soundtrack and all the kind of the gangster tropes that come with this kind of film, I think it's just a really fun movie. It's not without its faults, but I would definitely think it's top-drawer entertainment, and I hope that others will feel the same.
Well, what can you tell us more about the history of, I guess, Korean gangster film or their genres?
Well, it's certainly a big genre for Korean film. The public have always had this fascination with, I guess, what you would call jopok in Korean. And I mean, there are gangster films stretching back a long way, but particularly in the 1970s, they started to kind of come up. These kind of people like Im Kwon-taek were making these kind of low-budget gangster films. But really, in the 90s when it kicked off, again, Im Kwon-taek made this trilogy called The General's Son, which are set in the Japanese colonial period. And those, the first two of those topped the box office in 1990 and 1991. And after that, you know, there was a bunch more, but 1997 was a big year because that was the year before kind of the modern era of the kind of the blockbuster Korean film. And there were three very big films. There was Beat, which launched the career of Jung Woo-sung, and then there was Number 3, which launched the careers of Chae Min-sik and Song Kang-ho, and there was also Greenfish, which was the first film by the famous director Lee Chang-dong. So, and then after that, what was really interesting is that the genre tropes became absorbed into other genres. So they were kind of blending them with comedy and particularly romance. So we had all these films like the Marrying the Mafia franchise, My Wife is a Gangster, My Boss, My Hero, all these kinds of films. Even if you look at 2001, half of the top 10 Korean films were gangster films, and most of those were kind of hybrids of comedy and romance.
Okay, well, you seem like you're quite a fan of this genre. Well, do you have any favorites you could share with us?
I certainly do. I've already mentioned A Dirty Carnival, and I think that would be my favorite. It's a very classical and straightforward film. It's kind of an up-and-down narrative of a young gangster who goes up, and of course he gets a little too big for his boots, and things start to go badly. But beyond that, it's just it's filled with kind of symbolism. It's just really well made. Yoo-ha is a really incredible technical director, but he's actually a poet. He was a poet before a filmmaker, and you can really see that kind of blend, particularly in this film. So that was really one that's kind of stayed with me over the years. Another very famous example is Kim Ji-yoon's A Bittersweet Life, starring Lee Byung-hun. And so that's kind of the tale of one gangster and then eventually his revenge against his gang when they turn his back on him. Looking at more independent fare, there are actually a number of low-budget gangster films. So the best of those is probably Yang Ik-jun's Breathless from 2009. A really gritty but very fascinating film. And then we have Rough Cut, another great film by Jang Hoon, which it stars So Ji-sub, and it kind of blends the world of film and the world of gangsters. So it's really fun. And then I mentioned already some popular gangster films of recent years, and those would be Nameless Gangster and New World. Both of them actually starred Chae Min-sik. Both really kind of fun gangster films. And then, of course, I'm happy to add Gangnam Blues to that list, which I do think will go down as one of the best Korean gangster films.
Wow, thanks for that whole list of films there. You know, my husband and I were both big fan of this genre, this gangster film genre, and I'm pretty sure maybe we'll check out the Gangnam Blues, I guess, this weekend. All right, thanks for coming in today, Pierce.
Good afternoon, I'm Michelle Park here with the latest weather forecast. We have more spring-like weather here in Korea today, and currently with all the cloud cover, the air feels much colder than the usual, but temperatures are still above the seasonal average with daytime highs expected to range between 3 and 11 degrees Celsius. Now we have partly cloudy skies at the moment, which will clear up as we proceed into the day. Now, whereas some regions, including Seoul, are also experiencing a smog effect due to a mix of dust and fog, which will slowly fade away as the temperature rises. And for those of you looking forward to the weekend, the weather will generally be fine with similar highs and lows until Sunday evening, that is, when rain is expected to fall nationwide starting in Seoul. Now let's take a closer look at the readings for today. Seoul will peak up to 5 this afternoon. Meanwhile, the southern cities such as Gwangju and Busan will reach higher at 8 and 9 degrees. Now moving over to other regions, Jeju Island gets up higher at 11, Dokdo hits down to 3, while Mangkungang drops down low to -4 degrees. Well, that's all for now. Michelle Park, and here's a look at the weather conditions around the world.
That brings us to the end, but we'll be back with more at 4 p.m. Korea time. Thanks for watching.